Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered territory. At 34, he had learned what most men never discover, that attraction is not about luck, genetics, or charm. It is about power, not the crude power of wealth or status, though these helped, but the subtle psychological power that comes from understanding human nature at its most fundamental level. The revelation had come to him 5 years earlier, during what he now considered his metamorphosis. He had been weak then, desperate for approval, seeking validation from every woman who crossed his path, believing that niceness and accommodation would win hearts. He had been wrong, catastrophically so. The woman he had loved most, Elena, had left him for a man who treated her with calculated indifference, who made her chase, who kept her in a constant state of uncertainty about where she stood. That night, as Marcus sat in his empty apartment surrounded by the remnants of his failed relationship, he made a decision that would reshape not just his romantic life but his entire existence. He would study power, not just political power, as Machiavelli had, but personal power, psychological power, the kind that makes people gravitate toward you, respect you, and most importantly, remember you long after you've left the room. The first principle he discovered was counterintuitive. To be remembered, one must be unpredictable. Predictability breeds contempt, or at best, indifference. The human mind craves patterns but is simultaneously bored by them. Elena had always known he would call when he said he would, always knew he would agree with her opinions, always knew he would be there when she needed him. This reliability, which he had thought was love, was actually the death of desire. He began to study the women in his professional circle with the cold precision of a scientist. Sarah from marketing, who was pursued by half the men in the company, always gravitated toward the one who seemed least interested. Catherine, the brilliant lawyer he occasionally worked with, lit up when speaking to men who challenged her intellectually, who disagreed with her, who forced her to defend her positions. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. The weak man seeks to please. The powerful man creates a dynamic where others seek to please him. This was not about cruelty or manipulation for its own sake. It was about understanding the fundamental psychology of human attraction. People value what they have to work for, and they dismiss what comes too easily. Marcus began his transformation by examining every aspect of his personality that had made him forgettable. His need for approval had made him agreeable to the point of being invisible. His fear of conflict had made his conversations bland and meaningless. His eagerness to share his feelings had stripped away all mystery and intrigue. These traits had to be eliminated, not just suppressed but completely restructured. The process was not unlike demolishing a building to construct something greater. He studied his own behavioral patterns with merciless objectivity, identifying every moment of weakness, every instance where he had sacrificed his own interests for the approval of others. The man who had once apologized reflexively for minor inconveniences learned to let silence fill uncomfortable spaces. The man who had once revealed his thoughts and feelings freely learned the power of strategic disclosure. At a company dinner 6 months into his transformation, he encountered Rebecca, a stunning consultant who had just joined their firm. In the past, he would have immediately sought her approval, asking about her background, complimenting her work, finding ways to be helpful. Instead, he barely acknowledged her presence. When she was introduced to their table, he offered a brief nod and returned to his conversation with a senior partner about market strategies. He noticed her glancing in his direction throughout the evening. When she finally approached him at the bar, he could see the curiosity in her eyes. She was accustomed to being the center of attention, yet here was someone who seemed genuinely unimpressed by her presence. "You're Marcus Chen, right? The one who handled the Morrison acquisition," she said, positioning herself closer than necessary. "Among other things," he replied, not turning to face her fully, his attention seemingly divided between her and the bartender preparing his drink. The old Marcus would have been thrilled by her attention, would have launched into an enthusiastic explanation of the deal, would have asked her about her work, her thoughts, her opinions. The new Marcus understood that interest must be earned, not given freely. "I heard it was particularly complex," she continued, clearly expecting him to elaborate. "It had its moments," he said, finally turning to look at her directly. His gaze was steady, neither aggressive nor warm, simply evaluating. "What brings you to Henderson & Associates?" The question was not asked with the eager curiosity of someone seeking connection, but with the measured interest of someone determining whether continued conversation was worth his time. This subtle shift in dynamic, from him seeking her approval to her working to maintain his interest, was the foundation of psychological influence. Throughout their conversation, Marcus employed what he had learned about the psychology of intermittent reinforcement. He would give her his full attention for a moment, asking a penetrating question about her background, then seemed to lose interest as someone else caught his eye. He would make an observation that showed he was listening, then create distance by checking his phone or acknowledging someone across the room. This was not game playing in the juvenile sense. It was an understanding of how the human mind responds to uncertainty and scarcity. Rebecca found herself working harder for each moment of his focused attention, and paradoxically, valuing those moments more because of their rarity. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which Marcus revealed almost nothing personal about himself while drawing out considerable information about her motivations, insecurities, and desires. When she mentioned feeling pressure to prove herself in the male-dominated consulting world, he simply nodded rather than offering reassurance or sympathy. When she made a self-deprecating comment about her negotiation skills, he didn't rush to contradict her. "I should get back to my colleagues," he said finally. Not when the conversation reached a natural conclusion, but while it was still engaging. "Perhaps we'll continue this another time." The phrase, "perhaps we'll continue this," was carefully chosen. It suggested possibility without commitment, interest without eagerness. As he walked away, he could sense her watching him, could feel the questions he had created in her mind. Who was this man who seemed unimpressed by what impressed others? What did he see in her that made him worth talking to? And what would it take to earn more of his time? Over the following weeks, Marcus observed Rebecca's behavior with clinical interest. She began finding reasons to stop by his office, ostensibly for work-related matters that could have been handled via email. She mentioned restaurants she thought he might enjoy, events she was attending that might interest him. Each time, he responded with polite but measured interest, never dismissive enough to discourage her entirely, never enthusiastic enough to satisfy her need for validation. The transformation in their dynamic was remarkable. Rebecca, who was accustomed to being pursued, found herself in the unfamiliar position of pursuing. More importantly, she was enjoying it. The uncertainty of where she stood with Marcus had awakened something in her that predictable admiration never could. A sense of challenge, of mystery, of possibility that had to be earned rather than simply received. This was the first lesson of Machiavellian influence. The person who controls the emotional temperature of the interaction controls the interaction itself. By refusing to be immediately available, either physically or emotionally, Marcus had created a psychological vacuum that Rebecca felt compelled to fill. He had become what psychologists call a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, the most addictive pattern of reward known to behavioral science. The weak man believes that showing interest will generate interest in return. The powerful man understands that interest, like all valuable things, becomes more desirable when it is scarce and must be earned. This principle extends beyond romantic interactions to every aspect of human relationships. The colleague who is always available for every project is taken for granted. The friend who always agrees never influences anyone's thinking. The man who always shows up exactly when expected is forgotten the moment he leaves. Marcus began applying these principles systematically to every area of his life. In meetings, instead of speaking frequently to demonstrate his knowledge, he spoke rarely but with precision that made others lean forward to catch every word. Instead of accepting every social invitation to prove his popularity, he became selective, making his presence feel like a privilege rather than a given. The results were profound and immediate. His colleagues began seeking his opinions more actively, precisely because they were not freely offered. Women who had previously seen him as a reliable but unremarkable presence began noticing him with new eyes. His social circle evolved from acquaintances who took him for granted to people who genuinely valued his time and attention. But the most significant change was internal. The process of destroying his weak, approval-seeking self had revealed something he had not expected: genuine strength. When he stopped trying to be liked by everyone, he discovered his own values and principles. When he stopped accommodating every request, he learned to prioritize his own goals. When he stopped fearing disapproval, he found the courage to express his authentic thoughts and desires. This was the paradox of Machiavellian self-development. By appearing to become more calculating and strategic, he had actually become more genuine. The mask of niceness and accommodation that he had worn for years had been the real facade. Underneath it lay a man with strong opinions, clear boundaries, and the confidence to stand by both. 3 months after their first meeting, Rebecca finally asked him directly what she had been wondering since that evening at the company dinner. They were walking back from a client meeting, having worked together on a presentation that had gone exceptionally well. "Can I ask you something, Marcus?" she said, her usual professional composure showing cracks of uncertainty. "Of course. That first night we met at the Henderson dinner, you barely seemed to notice I existed. But then you spent 20 minutes talking to me. I've been trying to figure out what that was about." Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her. This was a moment that required careful handling. Too much explanation would destroy the mystery. Too little would seem dismissive and might finally push her away. "You want to know if I was playing some kind of game?" he said, reading the real question behind her words. "Were you?" He considered this for a moment, watching the traffic flow past them on the busy street. "I was being honest," he said finally. "When I first saw you, you seemed like someone who gets attention easily. I was curious whether there was more to you than what everyone else was seeing." Our conversation suggested there was. This answer was both true and strategic. It acknowledged her attractiveness without inflating her ego, suggested that his initial disinterest had been a form of evaluation rather than rejection, and implied that she had earned his attention through her own merit. Most importantly, it maintained the dynamic that had developed between them. He remained the evaluator. She remained the one seeking approval. "And what did you conclude?" she asked. "That you're more interesting than your need for validation suggests." The comment was surgical in its precision. It complemented her intelligence while simultaneously challenging her to examine her own behavior. It suggested that he saw through her social facade to something more authentic underneath, while also indicating that this authentic self was what attracted his interest. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes as they continued walking. Finally, she spoke again. "No one has ever said anything like that to me before. Most people don't pay close enough attention to see past the surface," Marcus replied, "or they're too invested in maintaining illusions to point out uncomfortable truths." This exchange encapsulated everything Marcus had learned about the psychology of influence. He had taken what could have been a moment of vulnerability, her direct question about his behavior, and used it to reinforce the dynamic that made their interaction compelling. By suggesting that most people didn't truly see her, he had made his attention feel more valuable. By implying that others were too weak to tell her difficult truths, he had positioned his honesty as a form of strength that she couldn't find elsewhere. The old Marcus would have used this moment to reassure her, to tell her that she was perfect as she was, to eliminate any discomfort or uncertainty she might be feeling. The new Marcus understood that discomfort and uncertainty, when carefully calibrated, were the engines of personal growth and interpersonal attraction. People don't change when they're comfortable. They don't value what comes without effort. They don't remember interactions that leave them feeling exactly the same as they did before. That evening, as Marcus reviewed the day's events in his apartment, he reflected on how completely his understanding of human nature had evolved. The weak man he had been would have seen Rebecca's question as an opportunity to explain himself, to justify his behavior, to seek her understanding and approval. The strong man he had become recognized it as what it actually was, a request for him to maintain the very dynamic that had captured her interest in the first place. This was the essence of psychological dominance, understanding that people are drawn to strength, mystery, and challenge, even when they consciously claim to want comfort, certainty, and ease. The man who provides what people say they want becomes forgettable. The man who provides what they actually respond to becomes unforgettable. As he prepared for sleep, Marcus considered the second phase of his transformation, which had been equally crucial but far more difficult than simply changing his external behavior. Learning to project strength and mystery was one thing. Developing the genuine inner strength to sustain such projection was another entirely. For true Machiavellian influence was not a performance that could be maintained indefinitely. It had to become an authentic expression of who he was, or it would eventually crumble under the weight of its own artificiality. The foundation of unshakable personal power, he had discovered, lay not in learning to manipulate others, but in becoming the kind of person who no longer needed to manipulate anyone. This would require destroying not just his external weaknesses, but the deeper psychological patterns that had created them in the first place. Part 2. The Crucible of Self-Destruction and Reconstruction. The transformation of the mind begins where comfort ends. Marcus understood this principle intellectually before he experienced it viscerally. during what he would later refer to as his winter of reconstruction. It came 18 months after he had begun reshaping his external behaviors, at a moment when he believed his evolution was complete. Rebecca had become a regular part of his life, not through any declaration or commitment on his part, but through the natural progression of her increasing investment in earning his continued attention. Other women had begun to notice the change in him as well, responding to the quiet confidence that had replaced his former eagerness to please. But success, Marcus discovered, could be its own trap. The techniques he had learned were working so well that he found himself becoming attached to them, relying on them, and ultimately being limited by them. He was still reacting to others, albeit in a more sophisticated way, rather than acting from a place of genuine self-possession. The revelation came during an unexpected encounter with Elena, the woman whose rejection had catalyzed his initial transformation. They met at a gallery opening, one of those carefully curated social events where the city's professional elite gathered to see and be seen. Marcus had attended not out of any particular interest in the art, but because such events had become useful laboratories for observing and practicing social dynamics. He was in conversation with a small group that included Rebecca and several other colleagues when he saw Elena across the room. She looked exactly as he remembered, elegant, self-assured, the kind of woman who drew attention simply by occupying space. But what struck him most powerfully was his own reaction to seeing her. The old Marcus would have felt a surge of pain, anger, or desperate hope. The reconstructed Marcus felt nothing. Not indifference exactly, but a kind of detached curiosity, as if he were observing someone from his distant past rather than the woman who had once defined his understanding of love and rejection. Elena noticed him as well. The social dynamics that followed were fascinating to observe from his new perspective. Rebecca, who had grown accustomed to being the primary focus of Marcus's attention at such events, immediately recognized Elena as a potential threat. Her posture subtly shifted, her laughter became more animated, her touch on Marcus's arm more frequent and lingering. Elena, for her part, seemed genuinely surprised by the change in Marcus. The eager, accommodating man she had left was nowhere to be found. In his place was someone who acknowledged her presence politely but without any of the emotional charge she might have expected. When she mentioned that she had been thinking about him recently, he responded with the same measured interest he might show to any casual acquaintance sharing a mildly personal observation. "It's good to see you, Elena," he said when the group's conversation created a natural opening for private exchange. "How have you been?" The question was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to avoid rudeness, distant enough to provide no encouragement for deeper connection. Elena, who had perhaps expected either coldness or lingering attachment, seemed momentarily off balance in the face of such composed neutrality. "I've been well. I heard about your success with the Morrison deal. Congratulations. Thank you. I hope you're finding fulfillment in your work as well." The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes. Pleasant, superficial, completely devoid of the emotional undercurrents that had once defined their interactions. Marcus found himself observing Elena with the same analytical detachment he had learned to apply to all his social encounters. He noticed how she sought validation through subtle comments about her achievements, how she used physical proximity and touch to create intimacy, how she employed self-deprecation to elicit reassurance. These were the same patterns he had observed in Rebecca and countless other women, but seeing them in Elena, the woman who had once seemed so mysterious and unattainable, completed a circuit in his understanding that he hadn't known was incomplete. Elena was not the goddess he had once imagined her to be. She was simply another person employing predictable strategies to meet predictable psychological needs. His former obsession with her had been based not on her unique qualities, but on his own desperate need for validation reflected back through her acceptance. The realization was simultaneously liberating and disturbing. If his former intensity of feeling for Elena had been based on his own weakness rather than her strength, what did that say about his current interactions with Rebecca? Was he simply playing a more sophisticated version of the same game, using different strategies to meet the same fundamental need for validation? That night, alone in his apartment, Marcus confronted a possibility that challenged the foundation of his transformation. Perhaps the problem was not that he had been too weak before, but that he was still operating from a position of weakness disguised as strength. True strength, he began to suspect, would not require any strategies at all. It would simply exist unshakable and self-contained, requiring nothing from others to maintain itself. This insight marked the beginning of the most difficult phase of his evolution. The external techniques he had learned, strategic scarcity, emotional unavailability, calculated unpredictability, had been tools for managing his interactions with others. But they were still tools, which meant he was still dependent on something outside himself for his sense of power and identity. A truly powerful person, he realized, would not need tools. He would simply be powerful, in the same way that a mountain does not need to appear imposing. It simply is imposing by virtue of its nature. The challenge was that dismantling his carefully constructed persona felt like returning to weakness. The behaviors that had brought him success with Rebecca and others had become habits, and habits create comfort zones just as surely as any other patterns of behavior. But comfort, Marcus had learned, was the enemy of growth. If he was to reach the next level of his evolution, he would need to destroy not just his original weak self, but also the strategically strong self he had built to replace it. He began by conducting an experiment that terrified him. He stopped using techniques altogether. No more strategic scarcity, no more calculated responses, no more careful management of emotional temperature. Instead, he simply observed his own authentic responses to situations and acted on them, regardless of whether they conformed to the patterns that had been successful before. The results were initially disastrous. Rebecca, accustomed to his measured unavailability, was confused by his sudden directness. When she asked about his weekend plans, instead of giving a vague response that suggested other priorities, he told her exactly what he intended to do. When she made one of her subtle bids for reassurance, instead of maintaining strategic distance, he offered his honest opinion about whatever she was concerned about. "You seem different lately," she said after a dinner where he had been unusually forthcoming about his thoughts and feelings. "More accessible, I guess." "Does that bother you?" he asked, genuinely curious about her response. She considered this for a moment. "It's not that it bothers me. Exactly. It's just unexpected. I was getting used to having to work a little harder for your attention." This comment illuminated something crucial about the dynamic he had created. Rebecca's attraction had indeed been based partly on the challenge he represented, but it had also been based on something deeper, the sense that his attention, when given, was valuable because it was not given lightly. The strategic scarcity had been a symptom of his selectivity, not the cause of it. Over the following weeks, Marcus discovered that abandoning his techniques did not mean returning to his original weakness, provided that the selectivity behind the techniques had become genuine. He no longer needed to artificially create scarcity because he had become naturally selective about where he invested his time and energy. He no longer needed to calculate his responses because his authentic responses had been refined by months of conscious development. This was the difference between strategic behavior and authentic strength. Strategic behavior requires constant maintenance and can be disrupted by unexpected circumstances. Authentic strength is self-sustaining because it arises from genuine personal development rather than learned techniques. The process of destroying his strategic self was painful in ways that destroying his weak self had not been. The weak self had been obviously limiting and dysfunctional. The strategic self had been successful and effective. Letting go of what works requires a different kind of courage than letting go of what doesn't work. It requires faith that something better exists beyond the current level of success. Marcus found this faith through a practice he had not anticipated: solitude. Not the temporary solitude of an evening alone, but extended periods of deliberately choosing his own company over social interaction. He began declining invitations not strategically, to create scarcity, but because he genuinely preferred to spend time developing his own interests and understanding. He read voraciously, not just books on psychology and influence, but philosophy, history, literature, science. He took up activities that interested him regardless of their social value: cooking complex dishes for himself alone, learning to play piano, practicing martial arts. He traveled by himself to places he had always wanted to see, experiencing them without the filter of anyone else's expectations or reactions. Slowly, something unexpected began to emerge from this extended period of self-focus: genuine contentment. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus discovered that he could be completely satisfied with his own company. This was not the bitter satisfaction of the misanthrope who withdraws from others out of resentment, but the peaceful satisfaction of someone who has found something worthwhile in solitude. This contentment, paradoxically, made him more attractive to others than any of his previous strategies had. People began to notice a quality in him that was difficult to define: a kind of centered presence that suggested he would be perfectly fine whether they chose to engage with him or not. This was not indifference to others, but rather freedom from dependence on others for his sense of well-being. Rebecca was among the first to comment on this change. "You seem so settled lately," she observed during one of their increasingly infrequent dinners together. "Like you've figured something out that I'm still working on." "What do you think I've figured out?" he asked, not because he was fishing for compliments, but because he was genuinely curious about how his transformation appeared to others. How to be happy by yourself. Most people, myself included, seem to need other people to feel complete. You seem complete on your own, and other people are just a bonus. Her observation was remarkably accurate. Marcus had indeed learned to be complete on his own, and this completeness had fundamentally altered every interaction he had with others. When someone's approval or disapproval could not significantly impact his baseline sense of well-being, he was free to engage with them authentically rather than strategically. This freedom created a new kind of influence that was far more powerful than anything he had achieved through conscious technique. People found themselves drawn to his presence because it offered something rare in their social experience. Genuine acceptance combined with complete emotional independence. He was interested in others without needing anything from them, supportive without being dependent, engaging without being attached to outcomes. The transformation was perhaps most evident in his interactions with women, where the old Marcus had been desperately seeking validation and the strategic Marcus had been carefully managing dynamics. The integrated Marcus was simply himself, interested, selective, present, and fundamentally unshakable. This combination proved to be irresistible to women who had grown weary of men, who either needed too much from them or were playing obvious games to avoid appearing needy. A year into this phase of his development, Marcus encountered a woman named Victoria at a conference on international business law. Their meeting was entirely unremarkable, a brief conversation during a coffee break about the speaker's presentation on regulatory changes in emerging markets. But something in their exchange caught his attention in a way that hadn't happened since his transformation began. Victoria possessed a quality that set her apart from the other women he had been meeting. She seemed as genuinely content in herself as he had become. When they spoke, he noticed that she listened to his responses not to gather information about his availability or interest level, but because she was genuinely engaged with his ideas. When she shared her own thoughts, they came across not as bids for validation, but as authentic expressions of her perspective. For the first time in years, Marcus found himself in conversation with someone who seemed to need nothing from him beyond the exchange of ideas itself. This mutual independence created a dynamic unlike any he had experienced before. Instead of one person pursuing and the other being pursued, both were simply present, engaged, and complete in themselves. Their conversation continued over lunch, then extended into the afternoon coffee break, then resumed that evening at the conference dinner. At no point did either of them employ the subtle strategies that characterize most early interactions between potentially romantic partners. There was no testing, no positioning, no careful management of interest levels. They simply enjoyed each other's company for its own sake. "This is unusual," Victoria observed as they walked through the hotel lobby after the dinner had ended. "I don't think I've ever had a conversation this long without either person trying to impress the other." Marcus smiled, recognizing the same quality in their interaction that had made it so compelling to him. "Maybe that's because neither of us needs to be impressed. Or maybe because we're both too tired from the conference to maintain our usual social performances," she suggested with a laugh. But they both knew that wasn't true. The ease of their interaction had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with the fact that they had each reached a level of personal development where genuine connection was more interesting than social maneuvering. Over the following months, as their professional collaboration evolved into personal friendship and eventually into something deeper, Marcus experienced what he had not known he was missing in all his previous relationships: partnership between equals. Victoria neither sought his validation nor required management of her emotional states. She was as capable of solitude as he was, as selective about her commitments, as centered in her own sense of purpose. This relationship became the ultimate test of his transformation. With Rebecca and others, his strength had been defined partly in contrast to their relative dependence or need for external validation. With Victoria, his strength had to stand on its own merits because she was not providing the implicit weakness against which he could appear strong. The experience was revelatory. True strength, Marcus discovered, was not comparative. It existed independently of others' weaknesses and was actually enhanced by others' strength. A relationship between two genuinely strong people created something greater than the sum of its parts, not because each person was filling gaps in the other, but because each person's completeness created space for deeper connection than either could achieve with someone who needed them to be incomplete. This realization completed the second phase of Marcus's evolution. He had learned first to destroy his obvious weaknesses, then to transcend his strategic compensations for those weaknesses. Now he had discovered what lay beyond both weakness and strategy, authentic strength that existed for its own sake and attracted others precisely because it needed nothing from them. The man who had begun this journey desperately seeking women's approval had become a man whose approval women sought, not because he withheld it strategically, but because he offered it rarely and only when genuinely earned. The transformation was complete, not when he learned to appear powerful, but when he became genuinely powerful, not over others but over himself. Part 3. The Mastery of Unshakable Presence. 5 years after his transformation began, Marcus had achieved something he had not initially set out to create, a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Not a reputation for wealth or status, though both had grown considerably, but a reputation for being someone whose attention was valuable because it was both discerning and authentic. Men sought his advice on business matters and personal development. Women found themselves drawn to his presence without being able to articulate exactly why. Most importantly, he had created a life that satisfied him completely, whether anyone else was part of it or not. The true test of his evolution came during what would later be remembered as the evening that crystallized everything he had learned about power, influence, and human nature. It was at an exclusive gathering hosted by one of the city's most prominent families. The kind of event where business deals were suggested over champagne and social alliances were formed through carefully orchestrated conversations. Marcus attended not because he needed anything from the other guests, but because he genuinely enjoyed observing the complex social dynamics that played out among the city's elite. These events had become laboratories for him, places where he could witness the full spectrum of human behavior, from desperate social climbing to effortless aristocratic grace. The evening's most anticipated guest was Isabella Rothschild, a woman whose family name carried weight in international finance and whose personal achievements in art curation had made her a figure of considerable influence in her own right. She was known for her intelligence, her beauty, and most notably, her complete immunity to the usual approaches employed by men seeking her attention. Marcus had heard stories about Isabella from multiple sources. Successful businessmen spoke of her with a mixture of admiration and frustration. She was clearly attracted to power and success, but seemed to lose interest in men the moment they began competing for attention. Artists and intellectuals described her as someone who valued genuine conversation above social positioning, but who could detect insincerity with surgical precision. Even the most confident men in their circle admitted to feeling somewhat intimidated by her presence. When Isabella arrived at the party, the shift in the room's energy was immediately apparent. Conversations became slightly more animated as people positioned themselves to catch her attention. Men who had been casually confident moments before began adjusting their posture and managing their expressions. Women reassessed their own presence in relation to this new variable in the social equation. Marcus observed these reactions with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal behavior. He could see the various strategies being employed, some men attempting to appear busy and important, others trying to engage her in conversation about her known interests, still others positioning themselves within her line of sight while pretending not to notice her presence. All of these approaches, Marcus realized, shared the same fundamental flaw. They were reactions to Isabella rather than expressions of the men's own authentic purposes. Each man had been knocked slightly off balance by her arrival, and their subsequent behavior was an attempt to regain equilibrium by securing her approval or attention. This reactive quality was precisely what made them forgettable, regardless of their actual accomplishments or attractiveness. Marcus continued his conversation with a small group discussing the implications of new regulations on international currency exchange. Genuinely engaged with the topic because it related to several deals his firm was considering. He was peripherally aware of Isabella's movement through the room, but it did not alter his behavior or attention in any noticeable way. It was this complete lack of reaction that eventually brought Isabella into his orbit. After making the circuit of introductions and brief conversations that social protocols demanded, she found herself near Marcus's group as they were debating the potential long-term effects of monetary policy on emerging markets. "That's an interesting perspective," she said, addressing a comment Marcus had made about the relationship between currency stability and foreign investment. But don't you think you're underestimating the role of political uncertainty in investor decision-making? The question was clearly directed at Marcus, and it was evident that she had been listening to their conversation for several minutes before choosing to engage. Her entry into the discussion was smooth and natural, not a bid for attention, but a genuine contribution to the intellectual exchange. Marcus turned to acknowledge her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. He saw immediately why Isabella had the reputation she did. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was the quality of her attention that was truly compelling. She looked at him not as someone assessing his potential utility or romantic possibility, but as someone interested in his thoughts on the subject at hand. "You're absolutely right," Marcus replied. "I was focusing on the technical mechanisms and overlooking the psychological factors. Political uncertainty creates volatility that can override economic fundamentals entirely." Their exchange continued for several minutes, with other members of the group contributing as well. Marcus found himself genuinely engaged with Isabella's perspective. She clearly understood the subject matter at a sophisticated level and was able to challenge his assumptions without being confrontational. More importantly, she seemed to be enjoying the intellectual exercise for its own sake, rather than using it as a vehicle for personal positioning. As the group's conversation naturally evolved to other topics, Marcus excused himself to refill his drink. He had taken perhaps 3 steps toward the bar when Isabella appeared beside him. "I wanted to continue our discussion without the others," she said. They were starting to look like they felt obligated to contribute, even when they didn't have much to add. Marcus smiled, recognizing the observation as both accurate and indicative of Isabella's own social awareness. "The tyranny of group politeness," he agreed. "Sometimes the most interesting conversations happen when people feel free to simply listen." They found a quieter corner of the room where they could speak without constantly being interrupted by other guests seeking Isabella's attention. What followed was one of the most engaging conversations Marcus had experienced in years. Isabella proved to be not only intellectually sophisticated, but also genuinely curious about his perspectives on topics ranging from international business to philosophy to art. What struck Marcus most powerfully was that Isabella exhibited all the qualities he had spent years developing in himself. She was completely present in their conversation, clearly enjoyed her own company, required no external validation, and seemed genuinely content whether others found her interesting or not. Most remarkably, she appeared to be as immune to his presence as he was to hers, engaged and enjoying their interaction, but clearly not dependent on it for her sense of well-being. "You know," Isabella said after they had been talking for nearly an hour, "you're the first person I've met in months who hasn't tried to impress me with something." "Should I have been trying to impress you?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Most people seem to think so. Usually by this point in a conversation, a man has mentioned his business successes, his connections, his achievements, or his possessions. You haven't mentioned any of those things." Marcus considered this observation. It was true. Their entire conversation had focused on ideas, perspectives, and observations rather than any form of personal positioning. "Would you have been impressed if I had?" "Probably not," she admitted with a laugh. "But most people don't know that. They assume that impressive facts about themselves will create impressive reactions in others." "And what does create an impressive reaction in you?" The question was not a bid for information he could use strategically, but genuine curiosity about someone who seemed to have developed the same immunity to social manipulation that he had cultivated. Isabella paused, seeming to consider whether to answer seriously. "Presence," she said finally. "Most people are performing some version of themselves rather than simply being themselves. You can tell because their attention is divided. Part of them is engaged with the conversation, and part of them is managing their image or calculating their next move. When someone is completely present, it's refreshing." Her answer revealed why their conversation had been so compelling for both of them. Neither had been performing or calculating. Both had been genuinely present. And this mutual authenticity had created the kind of connection that performance and calculation actively prevented. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself in an unusual position. For the first time since his transformation began, he had encountered someone whose company he genuinely preferred to solitude. Not because Isabella filled some need or validated some aspect of himself, but because their interaction had been more intellectually stimulating and personally satisfying than most of the activities he usually chose for himself. "I've enjoyed our conversation," he told her as guests began leaving. "I hope we have the opportunity to continue it sometime." The statement was completely honest, not a strategic move toward future connection, but a simple expression of his authentic response to their interaction. Isabella seemed to recognize this quality in his words. "So have I," she replied. "I'll be in the city for the next few months working on a new exhibition. Perhaps we'll run into each other again." They exchanged contact information, but neither suggested specific plans. Both understood that their mutual independence was part of what had made their interaction so engaging, and both were confident enough in what they had experienced together to trust that future opportunities would arise naturally if they were meant to. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Isabella did indeed encounter each other again. At a lecture on economic theory, at a gallery opening featuring emerging artists, at a dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances. Each interaction deepened his appreciation for her mind and character, and it became evident that she was developing similar feelings about him. What was remarkable about their developing relationship was how different it felt from anything Marcus had experienced before. With Rebecca and others, there had always been an underlying dynamic of pursuit and retreat, availability and scarcity, testing and proving. With Isabella, there was simply mutual recognition between two people who had each become complete in themselves and were therefore free to connect authentically. This authenticity created its own form of influence that was far more powerful than any strategy Marcus had previously employed. Because Isabella could sense that he needed nothing from her beyond what she was naturally inclined to give, she found herself wanting to give more than she had ever given to anyone else. Because he was clearly content with his life whether or not she was part of it, she became increasingly interested in becoming part of it. The paradox was profound. By needing nothing from Isabella, Marcus became someone she wanted to give everything to. By being complete without her, he became someone she wanted to complete her life with. This was influence in its purest form, not manipulation or strategy, but the natural response of one strong person to another's authentic strength. 6 months after their first meeting, Isabella made an observation that crystallized everything Marcus had learned about power, influence, and human relationships. "You know what's different about you?" she said as they walked through Central Park on a Sunday morning. "Most people I meet are trying to become something or get something or prove something. You already are something. You're not trying to become powerful or successful or attractive. You just are those things. It's incredibly attractive because it's so rare." Her insight captured the essence of Marcus's transformation. He had moved through 3 distinct phases, from seeking external validation to strategically managing others' perceptions, to finally becoming genuinely self-possessed. Only in the 3rd phase had he discovered what true influence looked like. The man who desperately needs others' approval repels those whose approval he most desires. The man who strategically manages his availability creates temporary attraction but ultimately remains dependent on his techniques. The man who becomes genuinely complete in himself attracts others naturally because he offers something that cannot be found elsewhere. The experience of being with someone who is truly present, authentic, and unshakable. This unshakable presence, Marcus realized, was what Machiavelli had understood about political power, but had never fully articulated about personal power. True influence comes not from what you do to others, but from who you become in yourself. The prince who rules through fear must constantly maintain his fearsome reputation. The prince who rules through love remains dependent on others' affection. But the prince who rules through genuine strength of character, purpose, and self-possession, creates loyalty and admiration that sustains itself. As Marcus reflected on his journey from desperate approval seeker to genuinely powerful man, he understood that the most important lesson was also the most counterintuitive. The way to leave a lasting impression on anyone, woman or man, is to become someone who needs to leave an impression on no one. When your sense of self is not dependent on others' responses to you, your authentic self becomes magnetic in a way that no performance or strategy can achieve. The weak man seeks to impress others and is therefore at their mercy. The strategic man manages others' impressions and is therefore dependent on his techniques. The strong man simply exists authentically and draws others to him through the gravity of genuine self-possession. Marcus had learned to destroy his weak self not through becoming someone else, but through uncovering who he truly was beneath layers of social conditioning and fear-based behavior. The man who emerged from this process of destruction and reconstruction was not a calculated creation, but his authentic self finally free to exist without apology or pretense. This authenticity had become his greatest source of power, and paradoxically, his greatest act of service to others. By refusing to be anything other than genuinely himself, He gave everyone around him permission to do the same. By needing nothing from others, he created space for them to give freely. By being unshakable in his own center, he became a source of stability in others' lives. The evening of Isabella's observation, as Marcus prepared for sleep in the apartment that had been witness to his entire transformation, he considered the man he had become and the journey that had brought him there. The desperate, approval-seeking person he had been 5 years earlier seemed like a different individual entirely, not because Marcus had rejected that person, but because he had integrated and transcended him. Every aspect of his current life reflected this integration. His professional success came not from desperate ambition, but from genuine excellence. His social relationships were based on mutual value rather than need. His romantic connection with Isabella represented partnership between equals rather than the filling of psychological gaps. Most importantly, he had achieved something he had not even known to aspire to when his transformation began: complete contentment with who he was. This contentment was not complacency. He continued to grow and evolve. But it was freedom from the constant anxiety that had once driven him to seek validation from others. The man who destroys his weak self, Marcus understood, cannot be destroyed by others because he has already done the hardest work himself. He has faced his own inadequacies, transformed his own limitations, and built his own strength. External criticism, rejection, or approval cannot fundamentally alter someone who has done this level of internal work, because his sense of identity is no longer dependent on external feedback. This was the ultimate Machiavellian insight. True power is internal. The prince who depends on others' fear, love, or approval for his authority will lose that authority the moment others' feelings change. But the prince whose authority comes from genuine strength of character possesses something that cannot be taken away by external circumstances. In relationships, as in politics, the person who has done the work of becoming genuinely strong in themselves offers something that those still seeking strength cannot: the experience of being with someone who is complete, present, and unshakable. This presence creates its own attraction that requires no maintenance, no strategy, and no external validation to sustain. As Marcus drifted towards sleep, he smiled at the realization that his transformation had come full circle. He had begun by trying to learn how to make an impression on women, and had ended by becoming someone who didn't need to make an impression on anyone. In losing his desperation to be remembered, he had become truly unforgettable. In destroying his need for others' approval, he had created something worthy of genuine admiration. The Machiavellian way to leave a lasting impression, he now understood, was not a way of acting but a way of being. It required no techniques because it was not a performance. It required no strategies because it was not a game. It simply required the courage to destroy everything weak within yourself and the patience to allow your authentic strength to emerge from the ashes. This strength, once achieved, became not just personally liberating but genuinely attractive to others, not because it needed their attraction, but because it offered them something rare and valuable: the experience of authentic connection with someone who had become genuinely themselves. In a world full of people performing versions of who they thought they should be, authenticity had become the ultimate aphrodisiac. The man who destroys his weak self and emerges authentically strong offers others the most powerful gift possible: permission to do the same. This is influence in its highest form, not the ability to manipulate others, but the capacity to inspire them toward their own strength and authenticity. Marcus's journey had taught him that the most lasting impression one can make is simply being real in a world that has largely forgotten what real looks like. This realness, achieved through the systematic destruction of everything false within himself, had become the foundation of a life that satisfied him completely and attracted others naturally. The weak man performs strength and fools no one. The strategic man calculates strength and impresses some. The authentically strong man simply exists and inspires everyone he encounters to aspire to the same level of self-possession. In the end, the Machiavellian way to leave a lasting impression was not Machiavellian at all. It was simply human, in the fullest and most authentic sense of the word. And in a world where such authenticity had become rare, being genuinely human had become the most powerful force of all.